Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining. I wanted to kick off this next set of work that we have in our software supply chain security working group. Although it is a working group, it really is a team of one at the moment. We've got Aaron fearlessly leading the charge on the development side for that group. So it's a slow moving working group. But we have been making progress through things, and this epic has come up as our next priority. So I just wanted to take some time here to make sure we all level set, since this does have a lot of cross collaboration, in particular with the runner group, to make sure we're all aligned on what we're doing and why we're doing it, and give us an opportunity to address any questions that may come up synchronously. So yeah, just to get things started, let me share my screen. I'll do a brief walkthrough. So if you're not familiar already with Salsa Level 3, just to provide a little bit of context on this, Salsa Level 3 is designed as a set of standards that help ensure the integrity of build artifacts. So specifically, there are a lot of ways that users can come into a pipeline, or a bad dependency could engage in a pipeline and could tamper or alter a build artifact, and the end user could potentially be none the wiser. And this effort by the Salsa group is to write a spec that allows a definition of all of the inputs that go into a build job and identifies all of the outputs coming out, puts all of that in an attestation or provenance document, and then signs it. That document itself doesn't necessarily mean that something bad wasn't run. You could just as easily still have something bad run. But if you have a list of all of the inputs and you know what the output is, you can potentially take that and reproduce the build somewhere else by following that same set of input instructions. And if you end up with the same output, then you at least have some indication that the build wasn't compromised in between those two steps. So you have to implicitly trust that the input steps are accurate. You have to scrutinize those yourselves, but this indicates that the build wasn't tampered with while it was being built. This is a pretty big area in software supply chain security, and this actually is likely to be the underpinning of a lot of other things that customers are asking for. Like we have our release evidence feature today. There's more than just inputs and outputs that we could put into this signed metadata artifact in the future, but we want to start just by meeting SALSA level 3 requirements, and then we can add on to that in the future. As of today, we actually have support in the runner for attestations. The runner itself, I can pull this up, will generate some provenance metadata. It supports Salsa. It supports Salsa level 1 because this is not signed at all. And even if we were to try to sign it today, users can go in and sign these, but the signing is done with their own identity. So even when we do provide instructions, pull this up, on using SigStore for signing build artifacts and for signing provenance files, all of this maps back to the JWT token that's generated through the ID tokens keyword, which maps back to the user identity. And this is fine for signing things, except that it's easily falsified. So if an attacker has access to that build environment anyway, and they're able to exploit things in the build environment, they can just as easily use this token to sign a falsified attestation as we can use it to sign a real attestation. And so because it's tied back to that user's identity, they could even sign a false attestation in a later job. There's no way to verify for certain that those inputs and outputs are real if you assume that the build job itself is potentially compromised. So let me stop there. At a really high level, does that problem space make sense? Are there any questions about that?
So the problem at hand is to find a way to sign things with runner's identity. Give runner an identity and find a way to run it in a way that the user can't get a hold of that credential.
That is exactly right. And the way the salsa spec is written, the terminology they use is trusted control plane. So they actually want some area that is has an isolation buffer between the build environment and where the signing is being done, where it's really like a one-way pane of glass, so that that trusted control plane can observe all of the inputs and it can observe the output, but there's no way for the build environment to reach back into that trusted control plane and tamper with the signing. Um, so yes, what you said is exactly right. And the first step of this, so really, identifying where we're at and where we need to go, Grigorish has done a wonderful job of outlining a high-level proposal for us. The first step in all of this is just to give the GitLab runner its own identity so we can use that to sign. Following on that, from that, we'll want to build out a trusted control plane outside of the runner. Likely this will be done in GitLab, at least per Grigorish's proposal in Rails. We'll want to take that attestation generation that we have today in the runner, pull that out of the runner, put that in the trusted control plane instead, and then we'll want to not just generate the attestation, but actually sign it as well. So it's kind of a four-step process here. The identity for the GitLab runner is really the first step in this.
What requirements are there around the identity for the runners, like integrity of that? Like if the runner leaks it, does that allow compromise of the anything or not? Like, are we looking to do things like secure enclave or TPM storage of that identity, or is that too strict of a requirement?
That probably would not be a bad thing to do. I don't think those requirements are in scope for the MVC here. It would be nice to have that kind of integrity. We also do get some benefit if we do use not necessarily Sigstore, but uh, I don't know how familiar you are all with keyless signing. Um, Maybe I'll pause, Joe. Do you have? I'm not
Yeah, I
sure if
got a
I should take your
question.
question now or later. Go ahead.
Actually, maybe now would be a good time. If you if we're going to upload artifacts and then have a trusted control plane sign them, that's not actually happening in the runner. So
That's right.
why is it called a runner identity and not a GitLab identity?
Because the thing that's doing the build is the runner itself. And so it would be the runner attesting to the inputs and outputs. That's what's providing us with the inputs and outputs, is my understanding. Probably a better question for Grigorish could give some more insights into that, or he would probably be a better person to ask that of, but that's my non-technical understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, the combination of Joe's question and my question really. If the control plane lives strictly on the Rails side, then we could build it with KMS or whatever uh, on the GitLab.com side. But if it really is the runner itself that needs to have the identity, that needs to be able to attest to it, then it needs to be in secure storage, probably, in order to have trust in that signing. So uh, it's probably where
Yeah,
I think the two of us are getting to together.
yeah, it would certainly be worthwhile to circle back with Grigorish and maybe poke at that a little bit before we start in that. Because if we do need to build this in Rails and not the runner, obviously that's a huge decision. We should make that up front and not at the end. Um, Assuming that it is the runner too, we do have some protections potentially against compromise of that key. So with traditional signing, you have a private key, and that private key, if that ever is leaked or exposed, effectively anything that was ever signed with it is rendered invalid. Um, we won't be using this exact approach to sign, but the way keyless signing with Sigstore works is that you use your OIDC provider to generate a JOT token, which creates a short-lived public-private key pair, so it's bound to a certain point in time. And then in order to verify the end result, you actually have to verify you store as part of the verification data, the timestamp is part of that too, not just the public key. And then all the verification data gets written to an immutable. Immutable is probably the wrong word. It's more like append only. So you can write to it, but you can't edit or delete anything that was previously written. Written to this log so that if a bad actor were to come in and compromise, if your private key gets compromised, or if they came in and tried to change the public key in the system of record, there'd be no way to do that. So we do have some protections there. We're not using this directly, but Grigorish has outlined a way for us to build out a similar sort of system inside of GitLab, relying on things like the Git commit history to help provide that audit trail and prove that it had been immutable and had not been changed. And that, we're going to include the timestamp in that. So yes, to your point of like actually store, we certainly want to store any secrets in a secure storage. I don't know that we need to go quite as far as having the acronym escapes me right now, the trusted compute module. What's the acronym for that you mentioned on the hardware side? I
TPM.
don't think we need, yeah, TPM. I don't know that we need to go quite that far at this point, but does that
Not for
help?
the Yeah, not for the ephemeral key pair, but we might need it for the JWT if the JWT can create more ephemeral key pairs. I'm not sure if
Yes, we might need it for that. I agree.
right. So I think something might still need to go in a secure enclave of sorts. But go on, Joe.
Yeah, I think will also be a question for Grzegorz. But I see that we're building the trusted control plane in GitLab, but also in phase two, he describes um, separating, like isolating the workload with a CI step. So I wanted to know how that plays in. Just for background, I had a conversation with him about like steps, just like if this has anything to do with this, and there's a variety of things you could do with steps. But in particular, we talked about like maybe if we needed a trusted control plane, it could live, in the job environment. But that's not what we're doing here. So I kind of want to know if there's anything steps related here or anything in the job environment we need to be aware of or runner itself. Like I just don't see where runner is actually like handling or doing anything different. It seems like this attestation is just going into GitLab and that's kind of it. So if you're listening, Grzegorz, help me out, man. I need, and I'll ping you
Uh,
separately.
well, I think I can help Joe answer really fast. No, Runner is not
Okay.
doing anything differently. I think the big change here is that can you prove that the runner process that signed the artifact is in fact the thing that has not been in fact been tampered with? Can you
Say
prove
that
that it
again for
is
me. Can you prove that the runner?
process that signs the artifact has not been tampered with? Is that about right, Sam? Am I getting it right?
Okay,
Yes.
so I have some job that like builds some stuff,
Yeah.
and that runner uploads these artifacts, right? And so when it uploads the artifacts, they're not signed or anything, right? They're just like, here's some artifacts, and then you sign it with the trusted control plane on GitLab afterwards. Is that true?
No,
Or is
we're
there
not
some?
signing the artifacts itself. We're creating an attestation that describes how those artifacts were built. So we're saying, here are the things that went into the job. Here are
Mhm.
all of the inputs. Here are all of the. Now with steps, to your question about steps makes it easier because steps has a defined set of inputs and a defined output, and so it's a little bit easier to handle that way. But we also want to do this for regular jobs too, right? Because the input for a regular job is really your GitLab ci.yaml file. It's the flattened job. Once you flatten all of that down and you have your resolved config, it's going to be what is that actual job that was run? What are all of the CI variables that went into that? Was there a cache made available to that job or not? Did it call out to the external internet? There's a whole list of like, here are all of the inputs and things that went into this. Here are the scripts that were run. And then
Okay.
here's the outputs that came on the other side.
Okay. So really, like it'll probably have a hash of the artifact so you can make sure the
Yes.
artifact does go with that attestation. So there's actually two things that I hear being discussed. One is what you're describing is sort of taking the step results of exactly what ran and inputs and outputs, and which can include like all the steps, like everything, even steps that call steps. That sounds great. That's a really great idea. But what I see written in phase two across the board is build attestation signing GitLab CI step for higher workload isolation. And when we're talking about isolation, I don't see how isolation is related here. It's not. It's just, you know what I mean. Like what I've heard so far, you don't need anything special like VM isolation from runner, right? You just have some steps that went in and some results that came back, and you can sign those in GitLab. So I just want to know if like maybe that's just how it's relevant. So that's a question for Shagosh, I think.
Possibly. I mean, from a end user product perspective, it would be great if we could support Salsa level 3 for both GitLab steps and regular jobs.
Oh, interesting. So say more about that.
So a lot of build artifacts are done in just regular jobs today, right?
Yeah.
Not everyone uses steps.
Hmm.
Steps makes it convenient, like I said, because it's a very clear, defined list of inputs and outputs. But I would think that we would be able to iterate through that for even just a regular job as well. Your attestation is probably going to be a lot longer. There's a lot of inputs, like our list of CI, the attestation that we produce today, the CI, we list out like 100 plus CI variables that are set going into
Mm.
a given job, right? But we can still capture those and represent it in a Salsa 3 compliant attestation. So the end vision for this would be to support both, um, so that we can provide complete coverage regardless of where or how you're building your stuff at GitLab.
Okay. Okay.
All right. I think that's all I've got to share on the product side. I'm probably already past product depth and way into engineering depth here. Any other questions on this for me? In any case, Grigorish was suggesting that we start building out the identity for the GitLab runner using X509 certs. It is beyond my technical depth to know why that is the preferred method of giving the GitLab runner an identity. I would say, like, regardless of how we design it from a technical perspective, just to kind of again recap like the product perspective here, the end state is that we would want to make sure we meet some of the key Salsa requirements of the attestation being unforgeable so that the build job itself couldn't forge a fake attestation and have it be passed off as legitimate. And we would want it to be entirely isolated as well from the actual build environment so that we have visibility into the inputs and outputs, but there's no way for the build environment itself to break out of its build and reach back out and tamper with the creation and signing of that attestation. So I apologize. I know there's a lot of technical questions here. It might be worthwhile circling back on these a little bit with Grigorish. I think we want to make sure our initial strategy here is right. But Aaron is coming up available here in this milestone to start working through it and refining it and putting together an engineering implementation plan. How can we best coordinate that work to make sure we're on the right track and that we're moving in the right direction? I would hate for him to go do a huge amount of work. And then at the very end, it's like, wait, we actually think we should have done this not in the runner or, whatever the case may be. And we have to go redo a whole bunch of stuff. I think that's the biggest thing I want to avoid.
I think from the pipeline security side, having runner identity anyways outside of Salsa 3 is going to be useful to us. So um, from that standpoint, I'm happy to I know a fair bit about X5 and 9, so I'm happy to help there. But I also think um, even if we end up not needing it for Salsa 3, I think it's going to be helpful for the work we're doing anyways. So um, we're probably going to end up using it at some point ourselves. So um, uh, um, all that to say, I'm happy to do it even if we end up deciding much later that we end up not needing it. So
I think there are a couple things there then. I think on that point, I guess which tied into my point, ASAM and Aaron, looking at the proposal from Ghosh for runner identity, there seems to be quite a lot there. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of involvement and collaboration, both a runner backend engineer for Rails as well as runner core. And if all of those steps that Ghosh has listed are required, I'm going to just off the top of my head, back to the napkin math, a good 3 to 4 iterations worth of work is there. Back to Sam's initial question, I think though, if the focus is really around getting the salsa thing done, my recommendation would be to have Joe and Gregor's kind of sit down and make sure Joe's on the same page with Gregor's idea, because I see where Joe is going with he's asking the questions about isolation and where the signing is actually happening and if that's actually solving the problem. I think that's a really critical step to happen, to have Joe and Grigosh on the same page before whichever engineer is working on this or collaborators actually starts doing the work. But just stepping back, if we just do identity alone, I just want to let everyone know my sense is the identity work itself is a significant amount of effort. It require a lot of cross collaboration.
Yeah, and thanks, Darren. That's a great point. Me and Grzegorz need to be on the same page, and I'll take that as a follow-up. I'm going to go just talk to him as soon as possible and just kind of catch up with what he's thinking about.
Yeah, and just to clarify to your question here in the agenda, Darren, like we don't have issues created yet, so Aaron isn't actually like hands-on keyboard coding right now. The first step is going to be to take this and the plan that Grigorish has and break that down into an actual implementation plan and create the issues to be worked on by himself. Right. But that's really so that's the first step. That's the phase we're at now. So I agree. I think that would be now is a very timely moment to make sure that we're all on the same page. Probably we need Aaron in that conversation too with Joe and Grigorish.
Yeah, Sam, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and Aaron probably is a very accomplished engineer. I've never worked with Aaron. But for example, let's just assume for a moment that Aaron is going to start working on switching from simple strings to JWTs. That on the surface seems like a quote unquote simple task. But in terms of the implications of that, we all like there's a lot of folks in CI needs to be aware of the implications in that potentially simple task. So that's why I just mean that once we define what those tasks are, especially for this area of the product, we just need to make sure everyone's on the same page. Hey, we're switching to JWTs. Okay, is that going to mean anything with how we're doing authentication today with the runner? Do we have to do anything on the core side, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, makes sense.
This might be a good segue to my number 4 then. In terms of like cross-functional iteration time for runner, we just kind of like kept it lightweight. Don't know if it actually is working. Happy to change it, but we just basically create a placeholder in our iteration plans, call it cross-functional. You can click through our 17.5 example. I put a placeholder in there for Salsa 3. I didn't put one in there in 17.4. We can always change that if needs be. And we just basically put placeholders for that work. So if the work that we identify from your team in 17.5 is just collaboration, we put collaboration and then make sure between Joe and well, mostly between Nicole, that we at least have an engineer assigned to that collaboration task. If it's actual hands on the keyboard, same thing, right? Just make sure so that's an easy way for us to say, hey, yeah, we identified some work in 17.5, run a team, and then we'll see if we can pick it up.
Okay, yeah, that's fantastic. That would be great if you're able to sort of placeholder out a little bit of collaboration there. We would really appreciate that for sure. Um, should we go to B or do you have more on A, Darren?
No, I'm good on my A. Do you want to cover
I
B in this call or do you want to do read only?
Uh, I can vocalize that just briefly, I think. So it's worth noting that for anyone to generate a SALSA L3 compliant attestation on GitLab, we're going to need to do some of this work. And the actual signing bit that gets done inside of the trusted control plane, it's to be determined what technology we're going to use to actually do the signing itself. We could use a testify sec to sign it. We could use cosign to sign it. We could just implement our own signing technology. But whether it's testify sec or somebody else, they're going to need this and we're going to need this. So we can, yeah, it is probably better for another call, Darren, but we can work out our product strategy there, whether we want to just have our own native solution or whether we want to let users pick which one they use. I think all of this work is prerequisite stuff anyway that has to be done regardless. So we can easily defer that decision quite a bit too. And to your last question, is there a desired target milestone? No, simply because we haven't yet broken it down into implementation issues. And so we've got to do that. We've got to size them. That's going to give us an idea of how much effort it's going to take. I mean, right now with just Aaron, it's probably going to move fairly slowly. I am working on some plans to add engineers to this project in the future, but at least for this milestone, it's going to just be Aaron. All right, we've reached the agenda. We're about at time, Joe. I see you need to drop any last minute questions or comments. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We'll consider this effort officially kicked off and look forward to the outcomes of those next steps. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tim.